friends, good afternoon and welcome to Reset Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Geography we are starting a new series on disaster management, and today we are conducting introductory lecture in that series. It will be dealing with disaster risk reduction concepts and evolution. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Professor R.B. Singh. Professor Singh is professor in Department of Geography in Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. He is also Vice President of International Geographical Union. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to his studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you, Amritpalji. Dear viewers, today we are going to discuss a very important topic, disaster management, and in this context I would like to use the word disaster risk reduction, because year 2015 has been very important for global community, because United Nations taken initiative for organizing a very important meeting that is known as Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction. So, in this context, I would like to take today various conceptual framework, terminology used in disaster management, and types of disaster. Disaster management is a multidisciplinary concept. People from different discipline, different areas of science, they can contribute in the wide range of monitoring, evacuation, search, rescue, relief, reconstruction and rehabilitation. It is also a multi-sectoral administration, and scientists, planners, volunteers, community all have very important roles to play. These roles and activities vary from different stages like pre-disaster, during disaster and post-disaster. There has been a paradigm shift of emphasis in the earlier from disaster relief during the early 90s to at present disaster risk reduction. First, I would like to put before you important facts in support why we need disaster management. Emerging facts, I would like to quote from UN Escape report. A total of 11,985 natural disaster events were reported in the world during 1970 to 2014. Additionally, the drought, heat and cold waves and other extreme events do not only affect the human population but also earth environment. Recent years, climate extremes have resulted in major disasters including loss of infrastructure, economy, natural environment and human population. According to the UN Global Assessment Report, more than 1.6 million people died due to different kinds of disaster worldwide during 1990 to 2013, with more than 95% death occurred in developing country. So you can understand from your own perception the type of problem people from developing country getting from this issue. First, I would like to start with a statement of Dr. Robert Glazer, a special representative of the UN Secretary General and head of the UN office at UNISDR. And he mentioned at Science and Technology Conference, Geneva, January 2016. I quote, "This transformation is pertinent to both developing and developed countries, because this issue truly affects us all. We are not going to meet this challenge by only responding to disaster, as important as that is. Rather, we have to transform the way we plan at the local, national, regional and international levels. And science and technology will be very important for this. Unquote. Natural disasters. I quote, it is a temporary events triggered by natural hazards that overwhelm local response capacity and seriously affect social and economic development of a region. Disaster may be defined, I quote, catastrophic situation in which the normal pattern of life have been disrupted and extraordinary emergency intervention are required to save and preserve human lives and environment. The economic cost associated with all natural disasters has increased 14-fold since 1950s. I would like to take this concept further and explain and elaborate this in a more descriptive way. A disaster, and this one I would like to take from UNISDR, that is the UN Office of Disaster Management, and also Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India, that is disaster management in India. A disaster is a sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community or society and causes human, material and economic or environmental losses that exceeds the community's or society ability to cope using its own resources. Though often caused by nature, disaster can have human origins too. Few more definitions I would like to bring before you, particularly Kuni defined disaster, I quote, a situation resulting from an environmental phenomena or armed conflict that produce a stress, personal injury, physical damage and economic disruption of great magnitude. Prage and Thompson in their series on natural disaster define a disaster as the occurrence of widespread severe damage, injury or loss of life or property with which community cannot cope and during which affected society undergoes severe disruption. So what you are getting from these definition, that coping strategy of society has emerged a very important issue in this context. World Health Organization use the one of the definition by the Goon, the result of a vast ecological breakdown in the relationship between man and his environment, a serious and sudden disruption on such a scale that a stricken community needs extraordinary efforts to cope with it, often with outside help or maybe international aid. Understanding disaster. And so, disaster may be understood like a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society causing widespread human, material or economic or environmental losses which exceed the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. So, it is a serious disruption on what? On community or society. It is causing human, material, economic and environmental losses, and when people are these losses exceeding the ability of the affected community and society to cope using its own resources. A disaster is a function of risk process. It results from combination of hazards, condition of vulnerability, and insufficient capacity or measures to reduce the potential negative consequences of risk. So, it is very important, pertinent to link disaster and hazards. Very briefly speaking, I can say hazards are extreme events and disaster is a potential risk of damage. A disaster is a function of the risk process. It results from combination of hazards, condition of vulnerability, and insufficient capacity or measures to reduce potential consequences of risk. While on the other hand, hazard may be extreme events and it will not become disaster if hazards are not impacting society, community. I would like to give you example. If tsunami occurred 500 kilometers far from coast, it is a hazard. But when it comes to coast and posing threat to society, human habitation, it becomes disaster. Natural hazards can be classified according to geological like earthquake, tsunami, volcanic activity, hydrometeorological like a flood, tropical storms, drought, biological like epidemics. Hazards can be induced by human processes like climate change, fire, mining of non-renewable resources, environmental degradation, and technological hazards. I would like to take definition of hazards given by Hygo framework of action. That was a second series of initiative taken by the global community. A potentially damaging physical event, phenomena, or human activity that may cause the loss of life or injury, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation. Hazards can include latent conditions that may represent future threats and can have different origin, natural, maybe biological, hydrometeorological, but induced by human processes like environmental degradation and technological hazards. Type of hazards, largely one can divide into two categories, human and natural. Natural hazards are like earthquake, drought, avalanches. Human hazards like including war, armed conflict, technological failure, oil spillage, factory expansion, fires, gas leakage, transport accident, collision. Now I would like to elaborate little bit the hazards, and particularly I would like to take up these two hazards like natural hazards which are caused by natural phenomena, hazards with meteorological, geological, or even biological origins. Examples of natural hazards are cyclone, tsunami, earthquake, volcanic eruption. For example, flooding may be caused because of heavy rain, landslides, and blocking of drains. So one can say both factors are responsible. So it is a environmental hazards also. Human hazards are hazards which are due to human impact. Human hazards are associated with industry or energy generation facility and include explosion, leakage of toxic waste, environmental pollution, dam failures, wars. Here I would like to classify this one like a geological. In this diagram you can see earthquake, tsunami, volcanic eruption, landslides, dam burst, mine fire, water and climatic hazards like tropical cyclone, cloud burst, tornado, drought, snow avalanche, hailstorm, sea erosion. Environmental hazards like pollution, desertification, deforestation, pest infection, and biological like human animal epidemics, food poisoning, pest attacks, weapon and mass destruction. Now I would like to bring very important concept like vulnerability. Vulnerability can bring disaster. If vulnerability meets with hazards, it becomes disaster. Vulnerability means susceptibility to a potentially damaging phenomena, extent to which a community, a structure, service or geographical area is likely to be managed or disrupted by the impact of a particular hazard. Projected in terms of class, ethnicity, gender, disability, age, economic condition. So that is why many vulnerable groups are emerging important threat to society. Now you can see these 4 important keywords in this diagram, and disaster is surrounded by hazard and vulnerability, influencing both and supported by capacity. Capacity reduces the impact of disaster. Capacity of individual, capacity of community, capacity of a nation. I would like to take another UNISDR for the vulnerability, characteristics and circumstances of a community, system or asset that make it susceptible to damaging effects of a hazard. Now we should devote few minutes on vulnerability analysis. It is a process which results in understanding of types and level of exposure of person, property, environment. This is likely to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of a particular hazard on account of their nature, construction and proximity to hazardous terrain or disaster-prone areas. What may be the important point? Need to focus on degree of loss and damage, focus attention to different elements, concentrate in analytical and significant items, concentrated population, lifelines, economic activity and resources, area of development importance and production facility. Now through this diagram you can see how vulnerability is a synthesis of physical, socio-demographic, education information, economic and environmental factors. And now there will be different subset also, like within an environment like a deforestation, ground subsidence, under social and demographic support groups, gender, age, these are the very important. In case of education information, the evacuation plan, that may be the very important. One can see a very close relationship between risk, vulnerability and resilience. I would like to bring this little bit explanation of this. Risk is a probability of harmful consequences or expected loss like death, injury, property, livelihoods, economic activity. Vulnerability already we have discussed, and resilience, capacity to absorb, capacity of a system, community or society potentially exposed to hazard to adapt by resisting or changing in structure, and this can be determined by the degree of which the social system is capable and organizing itself. Concept of risk, particularly I would like to take from the United Nations Development Programme Global Report on Reducing Disaster Risk. Risk is the probability of harmful consequences or expected loss of lives, people injured. Risk is the expected loss, life lost, person injured, damage to property, disruption of socio-economic and educational facility. Now here you can, this diagram, this formula you can see, risk is equal to hazard into vulnerability divided by capacity. So vulnerability increases the risk of a hazard turning into disaster, and capacity has the potential to control the risk factor. If capacity to cope with hazard and vulnerability is high, risk factor would be low, and if capacity is low, then risk would be high. Relationship between risk, hazard, vulnerability and capacity. Disaster is equal to hazard plus vulnerability minus capacity. So risk depends on nature of hazard, vulnerability of elements, economic value of those elements. So it is very important to see that first we have to see exposure, vulnerability and then risk. Risk is a third step. First we have to analyze vulnerability and exposure. Like risk elements in flood, everything located in the floodplain, crops, livestock, machinery, equipment, earthquake, weak buildings. There is a say it is a mud killing people and it is a cement saving people. Like landslide, everything located or at base of a steep slope, that may be the vulnerable elements. So in this way we can identify vulnerable elements in our neighborhood. Now I would like to explain capacity. It is a combination of all strength and resources available within a community or organization that can reduce the level of risk or effect of disaster. Capacity can be defined as resources, means and strength which exist in household and community and which enable them to cope with. Like I can give you example, rich can cope disaster in a more better way because they have some deposit, they have some seed storage. But what about poor people? They are not able to cope. So here you can see economic condition influences the coping capacity of individual. Type of capacity, physical capacity, like some family members have skills which enable them to find employment if they migrate either temporarily or permanently in case of disaster occur. Socioeconomic capacity, in most of the disaster people suffer their greatest loss in the physical and mental realm. Rich people have the capacity to recover soon because of their wealth. Now I would like to bring before you resilience. I quote, "This word has been very important now at present context." I quote, "Ability of a system, community or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate to and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through preservation and restoration of its essential basic structure and function." This was given by United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. Disaster mitigation and management both includes efforts and practices that seeks to reduce the ill effects of disaster. However, disaster management in more holistic term can be comparison to mitigation effort. The aim of both mitigation and management strategy are to reduce the losses in the event of a future occurrence of a hazard. What may be the aim of disaster mitigation? Primary aim is to reduce the risk of death and injury to the population. Secondary aim includes reducing damage and economic losses inflicted on the community as a whole. The objectives are likely to include encouragement of people to protect themselves as far as possible. Now, through diagram, you can see disaster management as a system approach, and how you can see risk analysis, risk assessment, you can vulnerability, and then you can combine integrated assessment for optimization of protection measures and strategy. Risk assessment can be done on the basis of exposed people, property, services, livelihood. Adaptation is another very important term, like adjustment in natural or human system in response to actual or expected climate stimuli in their efforts, which moderates harm or exploit beneficial opportunity. Exposure. It is exposure to what? People, property, system. Mitigation, the lessening or limiting the adverse impact of hazards. And preparedness is more important at present. The knowledge and capacity developed by government, professional response and recovery organization, community and individual to effectively anticipate, respond and recover from the impact. Disaster mitigation is combination of all these things, and it is earlier it was a relief based, but now it has a more on the sustainable component is coming up. Now DRR goal, I would like to finally tell, prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political and institutional measures that prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disaster, increase preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen resilience. So this should be our important goal, combining all concepts like hazard, disaster, vulnerability, risk and resilience. Thank you. Welcome viewers. We are now discussing disaster risk reduction, various conceptual framework, and now we are going to discuss in this session evolution and changing perception. Before that, I would like to highlight little bit on different types of disasters. Classification of hazards, if you see, there are two: physical, biological, and physical, external, internal, like a topographical, tectonic, natural, epidemics, and then infestations. According to the origin, now the natural include like meteorologicals. Under this, hurricanes, cyclone, tornado, topographical, landslides and avalanches, tectonics like earthquake, epidemics, different type of the yellow fever, cholera, locust invasion like a infestation. I would like to also discuss little bit about the man-made and technological hazards, and this includes industrial disasters, nuclear accidents, chemical accidents, fires, wars, structural failures, and finally I would like to, through this, I would like to explain and summarize the types of natural hazard and disasters. First group, water and climate related. Second, geological related. Third, biological related. Fourth, chemical, industrial and nuclear disaster. And fifth, accident related, like forest fire, urban fire, serial bomb blasts, air, rail and road accidents. Now I would like to bring before you changing perception of disaster risk reduction. Particularly, mitigation of disaster is attempted through the disaster management cycle that has primarily three stages: pre, during and post disaster. Disaster mitigation, community preparedness, relief, rehabilitation, response are the important components of disaster management cycles. Conceptual evolution, if you can see, the concept and idea of DRR and related notions have evolved over years, expanding its horizon from disaster relief in early 90s to coping capacity and relief intervention like a response and recovery in the early 2000s, to risk reduction, preparedness, prevention management, adoption to climate change by reducing the vulnerability and building resilience in present context. Now through this slide, I would like to bring before you the historical devolution and UN initiative. First, I would like to take up 1990 to 1999. You can see it is known as Yokohama Framework, and then International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction came into existence. Then followed by 2005 to 2015 HYGO Framework, building resilience of nations and community to disasters, and finally at present 2015 to 2030 Sendai Framework on Disaster Reduction. And I would like to tell you, all three initiatives and conferences held in Japan, three important cities of Japan, because Japan is very frequently prone to disaster. IDNDR, discussion related to disaster at the international level began in 1989 when the United Nations declared 1990 to 1999 as an international decade of natural disaster reduction in view of the increasing extreme events. This initiative focused on reduction and prevention of disaster itself, flood extent and associated damages were attempted to be reduced based on structural measures such as check dams, embankments and other technological intervention. Research on disaster during the IDNDR therefore often had a more technological perspective and had limited focus on reduction of risk and exposure as important components and drivers of risk. Then ISDR program was adopted by the UN in 1999 and thereafter called United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Research. It is followed by presently what it is known as UNISDR. The UNISDR is responsible for the implementation of DRR programs and a strategy among UN member countries. HYGO framework of action. So, after the IDNDR, the second important initiative came. It is known as HYGO framework of action, and it was between 2005 to 2015. It expanded the scope of DRR by involving the resilience component of community to disasters. It is adopted and the important initiative and known as building of resilience of nation and community to disaster and popularized the disaster DRR notions across the world. Main aim was to reduce disaster-induced losses of population, socio-economic and environmental assets. This promoted the active role of local learning, resilience building and climate adaptation through the integration of DRR into a strategy. 5 key priority areas I would like to mention coming from this. It is a priority in national policy, identified, assess and monitor disaster risk and enhance early warning, use knowledge, innovation and education to build a culture of safety and resilience at all levels, reduce the underlying risk factors, strengthen disaster preparedness for effective response at all levels, but community experiences were not well recognized and encouraged. The HYGO framework of action increased the emphasis of risk preparedness, prevention and reduction of risk vulnerability in comparison to response and recovery as focus during the ISDR. There was a change in the use of terminology natural disaster with a strong emphasis of disaster vulnerability. And now came era of Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction. You know, the Sendai city is located where East Japan tsunami affected areas are there. So, Sendai was the center of the tsunami, and so that is why global community taken initiative for a very important initiative is known as disaster risk reduction from between 2015 to 2030. It was adopted in March 2012 by the different stakeholder consultation, but in March 2015 this was formally adopted at the Sendai city. It is a successor of HYGO framework of action. It was discussed and adopted at the 3rd International Conference at Sendai. Over the period of nearly 3 decades, on account of global initiative, the average number of disaster-related mortality deaths per disaster have slightly declined since 1970. Here I would like to quote a special representative of the UN Secretary General and head of the UN office UNISDR at Geneva UNISTR Science and Technology Conference, where I also attended. I quote, "Implementation of the Sendai framework, we relied on integrated and multidisciplinary research that bridges social and natural sciences and uses both quantitative and qualitative data. It will rely on applied science that connects the macro to the micro." This statement is very important, where people from natural sciences, physical sciences, earth sciences, and human and social sciences can join together for this important mission, global mission. We have to take not only the quantitative data but also the community data. Community should collect the data. We should encourage our students, our children to collect vulnerability data from their neighborhood. We can identify different risk factors, vulnerability factors, and we have to go from macro to micro. During the World Environment Conferences, the one very important slogan is very important, and it is true for this also. Think globally but act locally. So ultimately, we have to search solution at a local level. DRR initiative taken at global level, but we have to decentralize at a local and regional level. Not all extremes events be disaster. In many cases, it is observed that hazards and extreme events are not necessarily leading to disaster, as they are managed well through better coordination of early warning. So preparedness, there is a book, Preparedness is better than cure. Through preparedness, and specifically I would like to use the term community preparedness, we can increase the capacity of individual community to cope with disaster. However, the number of affected people continue to rise over 10 years, leaving 1.4 million people injured and about 23 million people homeless. So, exposure and vulnerability levels of poor and dependent society, especially in low income country and low income areas, have increased, and so that is why poor people are more vulnerable. So that is why Sendai framework 2015 to 30 witnessed a paradigm shift. Thus, thrust is now shifted to adaptation to climate change, increased resilience to present and future hazards, and mitigating disaster risk. In addition to natural hazard, Sendai framework focus on human-made hazards and risk related to techno-environment and biological hazards. This can be, I would like to explain, natural to human origin. Earlier disasters were considered purely natural phenomena, but by 2012 it was recognized that significant causes of disasters are human in nature. Floods are not just hydrological events but can indirectly caused by human activity such as deforestation, changes in microclimate, altered runoff, and eventually floods. It was also recognized during 2005 and 15 that DRR can be further impoverished through governance. So good governance is also important, because through good governance we can improve the resilience community, local community, better preparedness and response community. DRR should be people centric. It should be, involvement of government for welfare of vulnerable groups, Particularly, I would like to use the word women, youth, poor person and disability, action-oriented transboundary cooperation, local capacity building, technology transfer and support was needed for better DRR spaces. And now the global community through science and technology framework is highlighting this. Fundamental aim of Sendai framework is to substantially reduce number of deaths and affected people. It also promotes the coordination and cooperation among its party, particularly the member country. DRR has become an international strategy to spread awareness about causes, impact and reduction of impact of disaster. Now I would like to bring before you 4 important priorities coming from Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction. First, priority 1, understanding disaster risk. Second, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. Third, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. And 4, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Now I would like to take few minutes for explaining these 4. Understanding disaster risks. I think we have to improve our understanding, science-based understanding, and we have to share different type of the experiences. We can strengthen disaster modeling, assessment, mapping, monitoring, multi-hazard early warning system. And we have to develop community to be handled by community, such type of the early warning system. To promote comprehensive survey to multi-hazard disaster, we can take technology transfer in this context. Second, particularly we can take the regional and sub-regional strategy through the create common information system, exchange of good practices and programs. We can foster collaboration, taking into consideration of some of the important challenging area like climate change, biodiversity, sustainable development, poverty eradication, environment management, agriculture diversification, health, food and nutrition and others. Second, strengthening disaster risk governance. Particularly here I would like to mention about the global platform for disaster risk reduction. And for Asian region, also the India participates in very actively in this, and every year it is happening in Asia. I think the one conference held last year in November in Delhi. A global platform for disaster risk reduction was also organized in May, this year May in Mexico. In this way, we can reduce disaster risk including epidemics and displacement risks. We can take the well-informed policy and programs. Investing in disaster risk reduction, and for that I think cooperation between developed and developing country is very, very important. It is very important to involve community, business community, international financial institution, and moreover, most important thing, to bridge gap between academic community, scientific community and research entity networks. I would like to quote Professor Virginia Murray, Chair of the Conference Organizing Committee of Vice Chair of the Science and Technology Advisory Group and consultant in the Global Disaster Risk Reduction. A resilient community is a community that knows what it could sow, because the science and data is there for it to have. I think I would like to appeal all citizens to become a resilience community. More awareness towards the awareness can bring action. We should improve our understanding and bring action. Now, enhancing disaster preparedness, for that we have to take the policy practice, reconstruction measures, a different type of the other initiative like a global framework of climate services, COP, we can combine together. And for that, we have to take lesson from Sendai framework of DRR framework like a target. Target ultimately is to lower the average per 100,000 globally mortality decade in 2020 to 30, substantially reduce the number of affected people, the lower the average global figure per 100,000 in the decade of 2020 to 30 in comparison to 2005 to 15, reduce direct disaster economic loss in relation to global GDP, substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategy, substantially enhance international cooperation, substantially increase the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning system. We have to develop such warning system so that community can use. Community based early warning system, local community can use warning system, and for that we have to develop the guiding principle based on the Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction, and in this context responsibility to prevent and reduce disaster risk. We have to take responsibility to be shared by the central government and relevant national authority, sectors and stakeholders. We have to give the priorities on property, health, livelihoods, productive asset as well as cultural. Many cultural properties are being destroyed by the disaster like a flood or earthquake. I think this dimension should be incorporated. India is a country of rich cultural heritage, also affected by the such hazards, and I think very little initiative taken for that. What are the important weaknesses of disaster Sendai framework of prioritization is very important, quantifying the task and implementation plan, more focus science and technology, less on value of local knowledge. Value of knowledge, local, particularly the community knowledge is very, very important. If you go to the Himalaya, Garhwal area, many people traditionally have been planting such type of plants so that landslides problem can be reduced, soil erosion problem can be reduced. I think such type of the plants should be identified and planted at a large scale level. Hazard part of disaster risk is overemphasized. Effectively combat DRR, it could focus more on vulnerability and resilience. What we need, effective strengthening of DRR, focus on global partnership between, not only between country, but between academic community, policymakers and community leaders. Integrated linkages of exposure, vulnerability and risk, collection and use of data, including the standards and innovative practices, knowledge have, better information, better management. Data collection should continue to be the very, very important aspects of disaster management. I think if we can involve the MPhil and PhD students, more than 70,000 MPhil and PhD students are getting fellowship from Government of India, particularly from UGC, AICT. If we can ask 10 pages data from one PhD student, that can be stored at one central place and that can be sent to the local stakeholders and particular ministry, we can contribute a lot in this context. Gender inequality, supporting publishing practices, youth involvement, science and technology in DRR with a active input from IAP, that inter-academic partnership, global network of science academy. DRR process is further strengthened by constituting a working group of experts on science and technology for DRR by IAP, bringing global issue to the attention of policymaker. This is a very important initiative taken, and Science Council of Japan is hosting, and World Academy from Indian National Science Academy, I am representing also in this committee. We have the people from Australia, Iran, Albania, USA, South Africa, China, Georgia, Canada, Brazil, Italy, India, UK and Mexico. I think we can contribute a lot for bringing science and technology for disaster risk reduction. This is a very new approach started by the Global Academy. Finally, I would like to quote here again Dr. Robert Glaser, a special representative of the UN Secretary General and head of the UN office of it is known as UNISDR. I quote, "I would like to take a moment for us to consider the profound responsibility that science and technology sector and all of us have for reducing disaster risk. We are looking at nothing short of a transformation in the way we go about economic, social and environmental development." Unquote. So, in this context, I would like to say that we have to start disaster related awareness activity from the school level. CBSE also has some component. I think we have to strengthen this component not only within social sciences but the science and engineering and medical faculty. Also we have to link the public health component in this, and I would like to tell the conclude with two very important statements, that investing to disaster risk reduction today for a safer tomorrow, and disaster reduction is key to sustainability. So, it is a very important for contributing to sustainable development goals started by United Nations, because this can contribute. Our country has 85% geographical area falls under the one or another disaster, and out of 36 states, I think almost 25 states are affected by disaster. For sustainability, we must focus on this risk reduction. Thank you very much.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Professor Singh for coming to our show and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.